Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's 2018 Anzac Day Last Post ceremony, marking the 103rd anniversary of the landings at Gallipoli. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Major Joel Tarleton. On this day, 100 years ago, on the 3rd anniversary of Anzac Day, Australian soldiers of the 13th and 15th Brigades recaptured the town of Villers-Bretonneux in northern France. In doing so, they played a pivotal role in halting the German Spring Offensive, which threatened to separate the French and British armies and crush the British forces by pushing them into the sea. By March 1918, the German Spring Offensive, known as Operation Michael, had reached the town of Villers-Bretonneux. While fierce fighting initially halted the advance, on the 24th of April, German forces using infantry and tanks overcame exhausted British defenders. In the distance, they could see the spire of the Amiens Cathedral. Their next objective was tantalisingly close. British High Command reacted quickly. The Australian 13th and 15th Brigades were brought forward, joining several British battalions, and hastily planning began to retake the strategically important town. Official Australian war correspondent Charles Bean wrote that he didn't believe they had a chance and went to bed thoroughly depressed, feeling certain that this hurried attack would fail hopelessly. The Australian soldiers thought differently, confident, well-trained, and prepared to carry through at all costs as they made their way to the start line in the dark. Some among them noted aloud that it would soon be Anzac Day. The 13th Brigade began their attack just after 10 p.m, followed an hour later by the 15th Brigade. The fighting was fierce and close, with little quarter offered or given. One German officer wrote of the Australians, "They were magnificent. Nothing seemed to stop them." By dawn, on the 25th of April, the Australians had surrounded Villers-Bretonneux. Within a few days, the town was cleared of German troops and the German Spring Offensive had been stopped. Shortly, we will hear the story of Lieutenant Ralph Claridge, who landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915 and died 4 years later during the Battle for Villers-Bretonneux. We're honoured this evening to acknowledge Mr Gordon Ramsay, Australian Capital Territory Minister for Veterans and Seniors, Mr Robert Semple, OAM, BEM, MID, Rat of Tobruk, and veteran of El Alamein and New Guinea, Commander Alan Masters, representing the Naval Association of Australia, ACT section, Mr Robert Dick, National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, Mr Kerry Stokes, Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Ms Christine Simpson-Stokes, the Honourable Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, and Ms Gillian Adamson, and Sharon Bowen, Member of the Australian War Memorial Council, and Mr James McMahon and Mrs Catherine McMahon, on behalf of the families that support those that have served and those that are still serving. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. We also welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. I invite you all to please stand and join in singing the national anthem. If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's first World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Lieutenant Ralph Elsmere Claridge. Ralph Claridge was born in Auburn, South Australia on the 11th of July 1892, the only child born to John and Serena Claridge. The family moved to Port Pirie in 1899, but by 1902 the Claridges had moved to East Adelaide. That year, Serena, who had been suffering from pneumonia, died at home, leaving John to raise their son. Claridge attended Marriotteville Public School and then Prince Alfred College. While studying at college, he was a member of the Senior Cadets. He went on to study at the School of Mines, where he studied wool classing. While in Adelaide, he met Hilda Giles of Unley. They began a relationship and became engaged. In 1913, Claridge moved with his father to Hectorville, where they started a poultry farm they called Brackley. On the 19th of August 1914, soon after the outbreak of the First World War, Claridge enlisted, joining the 10th Battalion, which was being raised at the Morfettville Racecourse. After a brief period of training, Claridge embarked with the 10th Battalion from Outer Harbour, Adelaide, on the 20th of October 1914 aboard the transit ship Ascanius. Initially destined for England, the first AIF convoy was directed to stop in Egypt instead. Further training in the desert followed before Australian troops were committed to the planned campaign at Gallipoli. The 10th Battalion left Egypt at the beginning of March 1915 and sailed for Lemnos. Claridge was amongst the first wave of troops ashore at Gallipoli in the pre-dawn hours of the 25th of April. After enduring the initial burst of fighting, he was wounded in the right arm on the 19th of May during the Ottoman counter-attack, which had aimed to drive the Australians and the New Zealanders back into the sea. He was evacuated back to Egypt to recover, but returned at the end of July and was promoted to Lance Corporal in September. Claridge's Gallipoli campaign came to an end in November when the 10th Battalion was withdrawn for a well-earned rest. After returning to Egypt in January 1916, Claridge was promoted to corporal at the end of the month. In February, with the AIF expanding in Egypt to 4 divisions, Claridge was transferred to the 50th Battalion. Early the following month, he was promoted to sergeant. The 50th Battalion left Egypt for France in June and was engaged in its first major battle at Pozières. On the 16th of August, Claridge was wounded in the right arm for the second time. Though the wound was listed as mild, it was still required his evacuation to England. He was taken to the 3rd London General Hospital at Wandsworth, and while recuperating, had his portrait painted by Melbourne artist George Coates. The painting was displayed in the Royal Hall as part of an exhibit in 1917, and it was featured in the exhibit book. In late March, Claridge was posted to the short-lived 70th Battalion, part of the effort by Australia to raise a 6th Infantry Division. Less than a week later, he was sent to Tidsworth to attend a school of instruction for officers. He passed the course with distinction and was commissioned to the rank of 2nd Lieutenant. With the disbanding of the 6th Division, Claridge was posted back to the 50th Battalion. He returned to France in early February 1918 and rejoined the 50th Battalion at Spoilbank Camp in Belgium. At the beginning of March, Claridge was promoted to Lieutenant. Later that month, the Germans launched their spring offensive. The 50th Battalion was rushed south to help blunt the German advance at Dernancourt and suffered heavy casualties doing so. After failing to capture the town of Villers-Bretonneux in early April, the Germans succeeded in the early hours of the 24th of April and wasted no time in fortifying their newly won positions. A counter-attack was organised for the following day, but was delayed until nightfall to minimise Australian casualties. At 10 p.m, the 50th Battalion began its advance south of Villers-Bretonneux. As the advance continued, German artillery and machine gun fire inflicted heavy casualties. Lieutenant Claridge was killed by machine gun fire while leading his men in an advance during the early hours of the 25th of April. He was 25 years old. Villers-Bretonneux was secured 2 days later, but the price paid for its capture was steep. The 50th Battalion had suffered 261 casualties. Claridge's remains were unable to be identified after the battle, and today his name is commemorated in the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. His name is also listed on the Roll of Honour to my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. This evening, his photograph is displayed beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Lieutenant Ralph Elsmere Claridge, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.